Good morning. My name is Nicholas Cabrena and welcome to Risk Management Professionals webinar series. Carine Black will also be co-presenting the latter half of this presentation. Our producers, John Watterson and Sarah Willman, will be in the background keeping us operational. Today's webinar will be focusing on DHS's CFATS regulations and how to prepare for an audit. We're using a GoToWebinar interface to support our presentation. If you experience any technical difficulties, please contact our office at 877-532-0806, the same number on your screen. We have staff available to help with troubleshooting. The image sizes for the presenter screen and the PowerPoint on your computer are adjustable. We also have a dialog box, a chat, and a question box. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them and we will address them at the end of our Q&A. This webinar series is part of RMP's ongoing outreach program. RMP's core competencies and expertise reside in EPA RMP, OSHA PSM, CalARP, and SEMS program development. In addition, we also provide HAZOP and LOPA study services, in addition to other hazard identification techniques, and a variety of other process safety and regulatory standards. Before we begin, I wanted to provide a list of all the acronyms that will be used throughout the presentation, as they can get confusing throwing them around. Some of the ones I wanted to point out specifically are CFATS, Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards. I'll be using that to shorten up the presentation a little bit. SSP, Site Security Plan, and SVA, Security Vulnerability Assessment. Here's a list of the topics that we will be covering in today's webinar. We'll begin with DHS CFATS eligibility, then move on to submission schedule. From there, Carine will cover how to prepare for a DHS audit and common CFAT deficiencies. And at the end, we'll come together and conclude with the Q&A. So the first topic, as stated before, is the DHS CFATS eligibility. So what are CFATS? CFATS are a set of U.S. government security regulations for high-risk chemical facilities such as chemical plants, electrical generating facilities, refineries, and universities. Unlike the EPA, DHS also considers the hazards of chemicals from a theft and sabotage perspective in addition to release. To ensure we're all on the same page, release refers to toxic, flammable, or explosive chemicals or materials that, if released from a facility, have the potential for significant adverse consequences for human life or health. Theft or diversion refers to chemicals or materials that, if stolen or diverted, have the potential to be misused as weapons or easily converted into weapons using simple chemistry, equipment, or techniques in order to create significant adverse consequences for human life or health. And lastly, sabotage refers to chemicals or materials, if mixed with readily available materials, have the potential to create significant adverse consequences for human life or health. So who's required to comply with the CFATS program? Any facility that comes into possession of any listed COI, chemical of interest, at or above the applicable screening threshold designated by DHS must complete and submit a top screen within 60 days. It is important to know that the DHS COI list is slightly different from the RMP PSM COI list. As mentioned in the previous slide, the DHS COI list contains threshold limits for release, theft, and sabotage scenarios. If a facility has a COI that exceeds the threshold in any of the three categories, you must complete a top screen. I get a lot of questions and people are like, well, what if I apply for one of the scenarios, for example, sabotage but not release? Am I still required to complete a top screen? Yes, that is an applicable scenario for a submission. For your reference, I have provided a link to the DHS COI list. Please refer to this list to determine if your facility is required to perform a top screen. The process of complying with the CFATS program is not complex, but specific steps must be followed. If a facility is in possession of a COI or COIs at or above the STQ, the first step is to submit a top screen. I provided some definitions from various sources that really encompass what these elements are about. A top screen is an initial analysis of the chemicals and security risk of a facility, which DHS uses to determine if additional requirements of the CFATS regulations must be imposed. It's really just a pre-screening event within the whole CFATS program. It gives DHS a good idea of if they will tier your facility. We'll get into that. An SVA, the second step after a top screen, is the identification of potential security vulnerabilities and the identification of existing countermeasures and their level of effectiveness in both reducing identified vulnerabilities at the facility and in meeting the applicable risk-based performance standards. The risk-based performance standards are used when developing the site security plan, but usually when developing the SVA, they are used in hindsight of knowing that you must comply to create a very solid site security plan that addresses the risks and vulnerabilities at your facility. And lastly, a site security plan documents measures to counter identified risks to a chemical facility's functions, information, people, and physical assets at a designated site. From the information submitted via the top screen, facilities that DHS deems vulnerable will be assigned a tier based on their level of risk. Tiering is based largely upon consequence modeling at the facility. This initial modeling from the top screen information is performed by DHS for you, for your facility. Tier 1 facilities pose the highest risk in regards to release, theft, and sabotage, while Tier 4 pose the lowest risk, as shown in the diagram on this slide. Facilities that are issued a tier are then required to complete an SVA and SSP. So after discussing some of the main requirements and general outline of the CFATS program, you might be asking yourself, when do these documents need to be submitted by? The timeframes on this slide were taken directly from the DHS website and CFATS regulations. Again, as mentioned earlier, a facility has 60 calendar days from the day a chemical facility comes into possession of any chemicals on the DHS COI list at or above the STQ. Additionally, if a facility is then given a tier by DHS, then again, they have to perform an SVA and SSP. These facilities have 120 calendar days from the day of notification from DHS to submit that. So after your top screen submission, usually it takes anywhere from 0 to 60 days for DHS to get back to you. If a facility is covered by the CFATS program, aka a tiered facility, then they will also be subject to DHS's resubmission schedule. Tier 1 and 2 facilities must update their top screen, SVA, and SSP every 2 years. Tier 3 and 4 facilities must update their information every 3. This makes sense because, again, the Tier 3 and 4 facilities are not as high risk, therefore they don't have as frequent of a cyclic resubmission schedule. In addition, there is another scenario in which a resubmission might be required. If a covered facility makes a material modification to its operations or site, the covered facility must complete and submit a revised top screen to DHS within 60 days of that material modification. And I wanted to kind of get this cleared out for the audience, and I spoke with some DHS representatives and some of the common examples of a material modification. Number one being if the facility plans to add chemicals on the COI list at or above the STQ, that's a huge trigger to resubmit a top screen due to this resubmission schedule requirement. In addition, sometimes you can be changing inventory. Most of the time, DHS is very lenient if you're already above the threshold and you're switching inventory for, let's say, the threshold is 100 and you're going to 150. That might not necessitate the need to resubmit a top screen, but it's always good to do your due diligence. In addition, another common example is performing a not in-kind process equipment change, as these changes can reflect possible changes in inventory. And before we move on to the auditing process, I wanted to provide some recent statistics issued out by DHS. These numbers are over the lifetime of the CFATS program, which began in 2007, so 10 years now. As of May 2017, DHS received nearly 60,000 top screen submissions from over 38,000 unique facilities. Of those 38,000 unique facilities, 27,000 have reported holdings of COI. So some facilities have submitted a top screen but did not have a COI, so for various other reasons. DHS has sent out over 10,000 tiering determination letters to facilities that have submitted new top screens. I double-checked this information and what it was considered new. New is just all-encompassing. Again, it is from the beginning of the CFATS program. So of those 38,000 facilities, unique facilities, 10,000 of them were tiered. And an interesting caveat that I found from some of the research they've compiled is 5% of the currently untiered population is expected to become tiered. So you might not be a tiered facility right now, or the facility that you manage might not be tiered, but depending on the material modifications that you make, you can become part of that 5%. So it's important to make sure that you're aware of the DHS COI list. What are the threshold values if you want to remain untiered? But this is interesting information. And I will be now handing it off to Carine, and she will discuss how to prepare for a DHS audit.
Hi everyone, my name is Carine and I will be helping you guys prepare for a DHS audit. So before we jump into preparing for an audit, I wanted to discuss a few more reasons why it is important to make sure you have implemented and kept up with your CFATS program. First, kind of building off of those facts that Nick was just discussing, we've talked with DHS representatives and know that DHS is continuously analyzing data from federal, state, and local agencies to identify potentially regulated facilities. So it is important to take the time to do a top screen if your facility has or will in the near future have chemicals on that COI list. Additionally, all facilities assigned a tier by DHS receive approximately annual compliance inspections. The consistency of these audits does vary a bit by tiering level as DHS prioritizes tier 1 and 2 facilities for more frequent inspections due to their higher risk. However, generally it is the goal for DHS to visit facilities relatively frequently. Also, the potential penalties for violating a compliance order can be pretty severe with fines up to $25,000 per day and orders to cease and desist plant operations, so it is important to comply and maintain your program and make sure that your documents are up to date. So moving on to the audits, CFATS has two different types of audits, the first being authorization inspection, which is conducted at covered facilities after an initial review of the SVA and SSP submitted by the facility and an authorization letter has been received. The purpose of this audit is to verify and validate that the content listed in the facility's authorized SSP is accurate and complete, and that existing and planned equipment, processes, and procedures are appropriate and sufficient to meet the established risk-based performance standard requirements. This audit is more about ensuring that the site security plan is sufficient, so the SSP will be open for modification at the beginning of the inspection so that the facility can make updates and resubmit the plan to address any findings found during the audit. Once this plan is resubmitted, a letter of approval will be issued. From there, the facility will enter a regulatory life cycle, which involves the second type of audit. Compliance inspections are conducted as part of a recurring inspection process after the letter of approval has been received. The purpose is to ensure that both existing and planned security measures identified within the SSP continue to be implemented fully and on schedule. The equipment, processes, and procedures described in the SSP are appropriate and sufficient to meet RBPS, and required corrective actions have been implemented and are sustained. So as I said earlier, these audits will potentially be performed as often as once a year, so it is good to be prepared and organized. The most important thing that inspectors are looking for during a compliance audit is that all action items discussed during the authorization inspection or previous compliance inspections were closed out and properly documented by the due date given to the facility by DHS. The SSP will not be open during this type of audit unless the inspection team deems it edits necessary due to a deficiency. DHS will also continue to review any subsequent updates or resubmissions of SVAs and SSPs for any major changes made to a facility. As long as the facility continues to satisfy the RBPS requirements, they will receive approval for their updates and receive a new letter of approval with their modifications. So what to expect during an audit. When a facility is audited, the DHS inspector should reach out at least 24 hours in advance to schedule a time for the inspection. Typically, this audit will take 1 to 2 days depending on the complexity and how well organized the facility is. There are 4 components to look out for in this kind of inspection. First is direct observation. This involves touring the facility, including all restricted areas, to give the inspector an idea of what kind of security measures are in place to verify the compliance. Next is document review, which involves reviewing all relevant records and documents associated with complying with the SSP. I'll go into detail later on what sorts of documents they are looking for. Testing encompasses executing procedures used to assess performance of the security equipment, processes, etc., such as intrusion detection systems or other plans discussed in the facility's specific SSP. Finally, interviews will be conducted with a variety of personnel who have roles in maintaining the security of the facility. These interviews are used to verify the execution of security measures, policies, and procedures. So, to efficiently prepare for an audit and ensure that the inspection runs smoothly, the most important thing is obviously to gather the necessary documentation for the inspector, but also to make sure that the relevant personnel are available for the interview. The types of employees that should be present are the submitter of the site security plan, facility manager, shipping and receiving representative, facility security officer, operations manager, human resources representative, and emergency response representative. Note that not all personnel will be needed for the entire audit, and there may be some overlap in the roles of the people listed here, but generally they're just looking to talk with anyone who is involved in maintaining site security and ensuring that the facility remains compliant. Additionally, in order for these personnel to be present during the inspection, each employee needs to take a chemical terrorism vulnerability information training through the DHS website. This is a very simple and short training that provides employees with an overview on the types of information that is covered under DHS. There are also several documents that ideally the facility will have on hand to review during the audit. These can be in the form of electronic or hard copies, and ideally they will be given to the inspector beforehand to review to expedite the review process on site. Documents to have available are chemical of interest list and any documents of change for that COI, also site map and facility layout. Remember, they will be doing a full walk down of the facility, so it's good to have that. Also, copies of the chemical terrorism vulnerability information training for all the personnel that will be involved in the interview portion, because they will not be able to participate without these. Also, the CFATS documents such as top screens, SVAs, and SSPs. Also, the new CSATS 2.0 tool where facilities are to submit this information actually prompts you to generate a PDF of your report right after submitting. So it's very easy to make sure you have the most up-to-date version of these CFATS documents. Additionally, security standard operating procedures and also policies and procedures on cybersecurity, company hiring, shipping, receiving, and also training documentation for any of these policies and procedures to make sure that your employees are on the right page. Followed by risk-based performance standard 18 records and also documentation demonstrating completion of plan measures. Plan measures could be a wide variety of things. This can include revised schematics, requests for quotes, proposals, statements of work, budget approval documentation, installation, maintenance records, photographs, work orders, all sorts of stuff. Obviously, there are more documents that the inspector might ask to review, but this list is a good starting point for the kinds of items to gather for the compliance audit. Additionally, a good way to make sure that you have compiled all the appropriate documentation and are staying on top of your action items is to create a binder similar to what facilities have for their RMP PSM programs. The inspectors appreciate when facilities are organized and prepared, and this will also significantly speed up the inspection process. So moving on to common CFATS deficiencies. We have had the opportunity to talk with some DHS representatives about the kinds of issues they frequently come across during top screens, SVAs, and SSPs. For top screens, some of the most common deficiencies are not reporting all of the chemical of interest at the facility. Just a reminder that a top screen is required if your chemical exceeds any of the 3 thresholds that we were talking about previously: theft, sabotage, or release limits. Or overlooking a chemical of interest because it is insignificant to the main process of operations. Even if it is not the most relevant chemical, your facility does still have potential vulnerabilities having it on site, and those should be addressed. Additionally, if this chemical of interest is outside, make sure that it's properly barricaded for the inspector to review. Also, not properly reporting facility location or other relatively simple administrative things that can be easily fixed on the top screen. There are also several SVA and SSP deficiencies that they've come across. One is not enough detail given in the SSP to protect the chemical of interest, and also not having the ability to detect potential attacks early enough to initiate a response. Once again, the whole point of the SSP is to make sure that you've touched all your bases and have your chemical of interest thoroughly covered, so you do want to make sure to go into enough detail for it to be secure. Also, not conducting proper background checks on all employees and unescorted visitors that may have access to restricted areas or any critical assets, which is also why it's important to maintain this documentation for anyone that comes on site. and also not relevant personnel having completed their CVI training and therefore not being able to participate in the interviews. So from RMP's point of view, what is your best course of action? First, comply with DHS if they request a top screen, SVA, or SSP. And make sure that your top screens are up to date if you have made any material modifications, and make sure that just generally you're using safe SVA, SSP practices, and those are what's currently going on at your facility. Additionally, if DHS has not requested an SVA or SSP, make sure to use public domain guidance to understand the concepts and apply them as needed to any potential vulnerabilities that your site might have. It might even be advantageous to consider implementing parts of the SSP plan or creating an alternative security plan. A great example of this is actually CalArt facilities in Contra Costa County in California. They're required to perform an SVA, even if they do not have to perform a top screen for DHS, just as an added safety precaution for their facilities. And then finally, if a top screen is not required, still make sure to selectively apply SVA and SSP concepts and make sure if there are any vulnerabilities that your facility might have, that you are aware of them and taking those into account. Here I have provided some additional information in case you guys would like to go a little bit more detail onto this subject. Obviously RMP is always here for you. I also provided a link to the CSATS 2.0 portal. This is where you should go to begin your CFATS top screen if you have not done so already. And I've also provided a general link to the DHS website for more in-depth information. Here's a list of our references. And then finally, this webinar series is part of RMP's ongoing outreach program. So we have a lot of exciting things coming up. One of this is using HAZOP and LOPA to create an effective mechanical integrity program presented by Steve Marr and David Childs. If you've been following along with the IIAR standards and how they apply to RAGAGAP series, we have part 5 coming up presented by Stephanie Smith. We will also be at the National RETA Conference, so we have a lot of exciting things coming up. I will now be bringing Nick back up here to answer any questions you guys might have.
The first question from the audience: how long after submitting a top screen will you get your TR letter?
Anywhere from 0 to 60 days. So usually the time frame after you submit a top screen, you get the 60 days to submit it, and then DHS also gets another 0 to 60 days to give you back a letter. From talking with representatives, usually their turnaround time is pretty quick. Sometimes they'll get to you within a month, but yeah, they get 60 days.
Thank you. How is DHS tracking and enforcing compliance?
So compliance is being tracked through the information that people are putting onto the CSATS 2.02 portal. DHS is notified if there's anyone who is overdue for a resubmission or has not fulfilled any updates by the required time that they needed to. And if a facility is out of compliance, they'll simply receive a letter from DHS asking them to come back into compliance, and DHS will work with them to make sure they get back into compliance. If they continue to stay out of compliance, that's when they start enforcing things like I discussed with fines and cease and desist orders.
Thank you. Next question. Where are the COI thresholds for sabotage found?
On the same DHS COI list that I provided earlier in the presentation, they have all 3 thresholds on there. For sabotage, sometimes it's a little different. They'll have a numerical value often, but in other cases they'll have like something APG, so like a placard value, and then you'll have to look at the information based off of that. For example, potassium cyanides, depending on if you ship the materials out of your facility, that might necessitate the need to do a top screen. But there was a client that we had that did not ship out cyanides, therefore did not need to submit a top screen due to that fact. So you have to double check that COI list provided earlier in the presentation. And also you can refer to Appendix A. They're used interchangeably. So you can also go on Google and look at Appendix A DHS, and that will give you the information you're trying to find.
Thank you. Next question. If inventories decrease for the COI at a site, does a new top screen need to be submitted, and would the decrease change the TR status of a facility?
The way I would answer that and I'll probably want to follow up with you, but if you're decreasing the inventory below the threshold, then obviously you're going to definitely want to update that top screen. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, if the threshold's 100 pounds and you have 150 and you're going down to 125, it is important to document those changes and resubmit a top screen. But then again, those are not necessarily the changes that DHS is looking for. They're trying to see if tier levels are changing, if they need to reassess the preliminary tier that they gave you in the beginning after your initial submission. But I will follow up with you to make sure if that's the exact question you were asking.
Every 6 to 8 months, 18 months, changes are happening to facilities. Is DHS receiving updates to this frequently?
Yeah, definitely. I attended a CSAT 2.0 webinar late last year, and I think one of the main questions I think someone brought up as well was the same question. And with their new tool, it's very user-friendly. It's very easy for people to go, facilities to go on there and submit their information now. So they've been getting a record number of top screens submitted after the new implementation. In fact, they actually had to impose a 90-day waiting period on their CSAT 2.0 tool because they're getting so many resubmissions. So for facilities that resubmit or update, they have to wait 90 days to do it again. So again, that might also add into the questions that we noted earlier. Do I need to update my top screen for inventory levels that are already above the threshold, if that was the correct question? Again, DHS does have that 90-day waiting period. So it is important to do so, but not exactly what DHS is looking for.
Okay, thank you. Last question. Can a facility's tiering level ever change? How and why?
Yeah, so a facility's tiering level can change based off of whether or not your security and vulnerability does vary, but that still is at the discretion of DHS when you make a resubmission, that kind of thing. So that's kind of more of a case-by-case basis.
Thank you. That's all the questions we have for now.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you guys for attending the webinar.